The great hall of the Galactic Council stretched like a silver dome across the artificial sky of Station Prime. Ambassador Kang De-ho walked through its polished corridors with practiced calm. His dark robe swept behind him as he made his way to the emergency session. After 30 years of service, he had seen many crises come and go. His aide, Park Soo-jin, hurried to match his pace. She carried a datapad filled with reports about the latest threat to galactic peace. The Vorthak Empire had begun expanding again, this time toward the peaceful colonies in the Helix Nebula. "The situation is getting worse," Soo-jin said quietly. "They took the mining colony on Kepler 442b yesterday. 50,000 civilians are now under Vorthak control." De-ho nodded but showed no emotion. In his decades of diplomatic work, he had learned that panic helped no one. The Council had ways to handle these situations, civilized ways that did not involve the messy business of actual fighting. The Council chamber buzzed with the quiet conversations of representatives from 100 different worlds. Each species had their own way of showing concern, but all understood the rules of proper warfare. No one wanted to return to the Dark Ages when conflicts were settled with crude violence. The session began with the usual ceremonies. The speaker, a tall being from the Centauri system, called for order. Her voice echoed through the chamber as she presented the facts about the Vorthak invasion. "The Empire has seized control of 3 systems in the past month," she announced. "They have taken civilians as hostages and are demanding territorial concessions from the Helix Confederation." Murmurs filled the chamber. This was exactly the kind of primitive behavior the Council existed to prevent. In civilized space, wars were fought with economics and careful pressure, not with the taking of innocence. De-ho stood when recognized. His reputation as a master negotiator preceded him. Many conflicts had been resolved through his patient work at the bargaining table. "Honored colleagues," he began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. "The Vorthak Empire has forgotten the lessons that brought peace to our galaxy. They believe that taking hostages will force us to act in haste. They are wrong." He gestured to the large display that showed the contested systems. "We have tools at our disposal that are far more effective than crude military action. We can cut off their supply lines. We can freeze their economic assets. We can make their conquest so costly that they will beg to return what they have taken." The chamber filled with approving sounds. This was the kind of thinking that had kept the galaxy peaceful for centuries. No one wanted to see a return to the old ways when different species would simply attack each other whenever disagreements arose. The plan that emerged from the session was elegant in its simplicity. Economic sanctions would be placed on all Vorthak trade. Their ships would be banned from using the major hyperspace routes. Resources flowing to their military would be slowly choked off until they had no choice but to negotiate. "How long will this take?" asked a representative from the outer colonies. "These things require patience," De-ho replied. "Perhaps 6 months, maybe a year, but the result will be lasting peace, not a temporary victory bought with blood." Soo-jin made notes as the various committees were formed to oversee different aspects of the response. The Trade Regulation Committee would handle the economic measures. The Hyperspace Authority would manage the route restrictions. Everything would be done properly through the right channels. As the session ended, De-ho felt the familiar satisfaction of a plan well made. This was how civilized beings handled their problems, not with the screaming and dying that marked primitive conflicts, but with careful thought and measured responses. Later, in his private office, Soo-jin brought him the detailed reports about the hostage situation. The numbers were sobering but not unexpected. 50,000 civilians, including families with children, were now under Vorthak control on Kepler 442b. "The mining operations there are dangerous," Soo-jin noted. "The atmosphere requires protective gear, and the work is physically demanding." De-ho studied the orbital images of the colony. It had been a peaceful place before the invasion, known for its efficient extraction of rare metals needed for hyperspace engines. Now Vorthak soldiers patrolled its streets, while the original inhabitants were forced to work in conditions that had never been intended for civilians. "The sanctions will pressure them to improve conditions for the hostages," he said, though something in his chest felt tight as he looked at images of children being marched to work sites. Soo-jin hesitated before speaking again. "Sir, there are preliminary reports that some of the civilians are already showing signs of toxic exposure. The Vorthak are not providing adequate protection. For a moment, Daiho's diplomatic composure slipped. The image of children breathing poisoned air while the council debated trade routes made his hands clench. But he forced himself to remember his training. Emotional responses led to bad decisions. The civilized approach would save more lives in the long run. We must trust in the process, he said finally. Acting in haste will only make things worse. The next morning brought news that would test everyone's faith in civilized warfare. A small diplomatic team from Earth had arrived at Station Prime. Humans were the newest species to be contacted by the galactic community, and most council members viewed them as barely above primitive status. Daiho had met humans before. They were emotional creatures who seemed to have difficulty understanding the careful balance that kept galactic peace. Their representative, Captain Lee Min-ho, had requested observer status for the Vorthak crisis. The request had been granted more out of curiosity than respect. Most council members wanted to see how these newcomers would react to proper diplomatic procedure. When Captain Lee arrived at Daiho's office, the human's first question caught the ambassador off guard. "How long are you going to let those people suffer while you debate?" the human asked directly. Daiho blinked. Such bluntness was considered rude in diplomatic circles. "Captain, you must understand that lasting solutions require careful consideration. We cannot simply attack every time there is a crisis." 50,000 people, Lee said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, including children. "And your solution is to wait them out?" "Our solution is to apply pressure that will force the Vorthak to negotiate," Daiho corrected. "Violence only leads to more violence." Captain Lee stared at him for a long moment. Something in the human's eyes made Daiho uncomfortable, though he could not say why. "I see," Lee said finally. "And how many of those 50,000 people do you expect to die while we apply this pressure?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Daiho had no answer that would satisfy a species that seemed to value individual lives over strategic thinking. This was exactly why humans were not ready for true galactic citizenship. They simply did not understand how civilization really worked. Captain Lee Min-ho stood in the observation deck of the human embassy ship, watching the massive Galactic Council station rotate slowly against the stars. His small team had been sent to observe how civilized species handled conflicts. What he was seeing made his stomach turn. Dr. Choi Hyejin joined him at the viewing port. She was the mission's lead scientist, tasked with studying alien diplomatic methods. Her usually calm face showed the same confusion and anger that Lee felt. "I've been reviewing their historical records," she said quietly. "This is how they always do it. Economic pressure, trade sanctions, slow strangulation of supply lines. They call it civilized warfare." Lee watched a supply convoy pass by the station, carrying goods that would never reach Vorthak space. The blockade was already taking effect. But on Kepler 442b, 50,000 people waited to see if they would live or die while politicians debated proper procedure. "How long do their conflicts usually last?" Lee asked. "The shortest was 8 months, Hyejin replied. The longest took 4 years. Lee closed his eyes. He had seen the intelligence reports about conditions on the mining colony. The Vorthak were forcing civilians to work in dangerous areas without proper safety equipment. People were already getting sick from toxic exposure. "They're going to die," he said simply. "All of them." While the council argues about trade routes and economic policy. The human team had been given access to most council proceedings, partly out of curiosity about how primitive minds would react to advanced diplomacy. What the aliens saw as educational, the humans saw as horrifying. That afternoon, Lee attended another council session. Ambassador Kang Dae-ho was presenting updates on the effectiveness of the sanctions. The Vorthak economy was indeed feeling pressure, but there were no signs they were ready to negotiate. "We must be patient," Dae-ho told the assembly. "Rushing to crude solutions will only create more problems." A representative from the Trade Committee provided detailed analysis of shipping routes and cargo manifests. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The Vorthak Empire was being slowly strangled by their own aggression. Lee raised his hand when the session opened for questions. The speaker recognized him with barely concealed reluctance. "What about the hostages?" Lee asked. "Do we have any updates on their condition?" The chamber fell silent. Several representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was exactly the kind of emotional thinking that marked humans as primitive. "Captain Lee," Dae-ho said carefully, "we must focus on the larger strategic picture. Individual concerns cannot override the need for systematic solutions. Individual concerns? Lee's voice rose slightly. We're talking about 50,000 people. That's not individual, that's a city full of families. More uncomfortable silence. The speaker cleared her throat. Captain, we understand your species places high value on immediate emotional responses. But civilized warfare requires us to think beyond momentary feelings. Lee looked around the chamber at the faces of beings from dozens of different worlds. They all watched him with the same expression. Patient tolerance for a primitive mind that could not understand proper thinking. Have any of you ever been to war? He asked suddenly. The question seemed to puzzle many representatives. War, as your species understands it, has been obsolete for centuries, the speaker replied. We have evolved beyond such crude methods. That evening, Lee called an emergency meeting with his team. The human embassy ship was small, designed for observation rather than military action. But it carried one important capability: quantum communication with Earth. I want to request immediate military intervention, Lee announced. His communications officer, Sergeant Bae So-young, looked up from her console. Sir, we don't have authorization for that kind of request. This is strictly an observation mission. Then I'll make it an unauthorized request, Lee said grimly. Dr. Hyejin studied the latest intelligence reports about Kepler 442b. The situation is deteriorating faster than the Council realizes. Or maybe they do realize it and just don't care. The reports painted a horrible picture. Vorthak guards were treating the civilian workers like slaves. Children as young as 10 were being forced to work in the mines. Several dozen people had already died from toxic exposure or exhaustion. They're using them as disposable labor, Hyejin continued. The Vorthak don't care if they live or die. They're just bodies to extract resources. Lee made his decision. Send the transmission to Earth Command. Full military priority. Tell them we have 50,000 civilians who are going to die unless someone acts immediately. Sir, Sergeant Bae warned, this will end your career and probably land you in military prison. Then it will, Lee replied. I'm not going to watch children die while politicians debate trade policies. The message went out that night, cutting through space faster than light toward Earth. It carried detailed intelligence about the Vorthak positions, the layout of the mining colony, and the desperate situation of the hostages. The response came back within hours. Admiral Kim Tae-won would be departing Earth with a battle fleet immediately. Estimated arrival time, 6 days. When word leaked about Lee's unauthorized communication, the reaction from the Galactic Council was immediate and furious. Ambassador Daeho himself came to the human embassy ship to deliver the official protest. This is completely unacceptable, Daeho said, his diplomatic composure cracking for the first time. You have violated every principle of civilized conduct. Military intervention will only make things worse. Lee faced the alien diplomat across the small conference room. Worse for who? The people who are dying right now? Or the politicians who want to maintain their perfect system? You don't understand the complexities involved, Daeho insisted. These situations require careful handling. Your primitive approach will only lead to more violence. Our primitive approach, Lee said quietly, is that we don't let children die for the sake of political procedure. Daeho stared at him for a long moment. Something flickered in the alien's eyes, but his training reasserted itself quickly. The Council demands that you recall your military forces immediately, he said formally. Any attempt to intervene militarily will be considered an act of aggression against galactic law. Then consider us aggressive, Lee replied. As Daeho left the ship, Dr. Hyejin continued her documentation of everything she had witnessed. The scientific part of her mind was fascinated by how an entire civilization could develop such elaborate ways to avoid taking direct action. They've created a perfect system, she told Lee later. Perfect for avoiding responsibility. They can watch people die and tell themselves they're being civilized about it. Lee nodded, watching the stars through the viewport. Somewhere out there, Admiral Kim was racing toward them with ships full of soldiers who understood a simple truth. Sometimes you had to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. The galaxy was about to learn what humans meant by primitive. 3 months had passed since the Galactic Council began their civilized response to the Vorthak invasion. Ambassador Kang Daeho sat in his private office, reviewing the latest reports with growing unease. The economic sanctions were working exactly as planned, but something felt wrong. Park Soo-jin entered with a classified data crystal, her usual professional composure replaced by something that looked like shock. "Sir, the reconnaissance footage from Kepler 442b has arrived." Daeho inserted the crystal into his viewing system, expecting the usual orbital surveillance images. Instead, his screen filled with close-range footage taken by a stealth probe that had managed to penetrate the colony's atmosphere. What he saw made his blood freeze. Vorthak guards were herding groups of human colonists into the central square of New Hope City. The civilians looked thin and exhausted, their clothes dirty from months of forced labor. But that wasn't the worst part. The guards were separating the children from their parents. Daeho watched in growing horror as Vorthak's soldiers lined up a group of youngsters against a wall. The alien invaders seemed to be enjoying themselves, laughing and making bets. Several held recording devices as if they wanted to preserve what was about to happen. "Turn it off," Daeho whispered. "Sir, you need to see all of it," Soo-jin said quietly. The execution was swift but deliberate. Energy weapons fired in sequence, each shot carefully aimed. The children fell one by one while their parents screamed from behind the barriers that held them back. The youngest victim looked no more than 5 years old. When it was over, the guards dragged the bodies away while forcing the surviving adults back to the mines. The whole thing had taken less than 10 minutes. Daeho sat in silence for a long time after the footage ended. His hands shook as he reached for his tea, but he couldn't make himself drink. The image of that 5-year-old child kept replaying in his mind. "How many?" he asked finally. 43 children in this incident," Soo-jin replied. "The intelligence analysis suggests they're doing this regularly. For entertainment." The word entertainment hit Daeho like a physical blow. He had spent his entire career believing that civilized responses would eventually solve any crisis. But children were being murdered while he debated trade regulations. "Has this been reported to the full council?" he asked. Soo-jin hesitated. "The Security Committee has classified it at the highest level. They believe showing this footage would cause panic and demands for immediate military action. And we can't have that," Daeho said bitterly. "Sir, nothing. Schedule an emergency session of the Security Committee. This needs to be addressed." But even as he said it, Daeho knew what the response would be. The committee would express regret about the loss of life, but maintain that their strategic approach remained the best long-term solution. Acting emotionally would only make things worse. The emergency session went exactly as predicted. The 12 members of the Security Committee viewed the footage with appropriate gravity, then immediately classified it as too sensitive for general distribution. "Releasing this would accomplish nothing except inflaming public opinion," said the committee chair. "Our sanctions are working. Vorthak's supply lines are severely compromised. They will be forced to negotiate soon." "How soon?" Daeho asked. "More children are dying every day." "Acceptable losses in service of a greater good," replied another member. "Direct military intervention would cost far more lives and destabilize the entire region." Daeho stared at them. These beings spoke of acceptable losses as if they were discussing shipping schedules. Children were being murdered for sport, and their primary concern was maintaining proper diplomatic procedure. Meanwhile, on the human embassy ship, Captain Lee Min-ho received his own copy of the reconnaissance footage. The transmission came through unofficial channels, leaked by someone within the Council's intelligence network who apparently had a conscience. Dr. Choi Hye-jin watched the footage once, then excused herself to be sick. When she returned, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "We have to stop this," she said. "Admiral Kim is still 3 days out," Lee replied. "And the Council has made it clear that any military intervention will be considered an act of war against galactic law." "Then we'll be at war," said Sergeant Bae So-young from her communications station. "Earth Command just sent new orders. Admiral Kim has authorization to engage any force that interferes with rescue operations." Lee felt a grim satisfaction. Someone back home understood what was really at stake here. While the galaxy debated proper procedure, children were dying. The human fleet's approach had not gone unnoticed. Council sensors detected the Earth ships while they were still 2 days away from Vorthak space. The response was immediate and predictable. Ambassador Daeho found himself summoned to an emergency session of the full council. The chamber buzzed with outrage over human aggression and primitive thinking. Speaker after speaker condemned Earth's violation of civilized warfare principles. "This cannot be allowed to stand," declared the speaker. If we permit one species to ignore galactic law, we invite chaos. Deho was called upon to present the Council's official response to the human fleet. As he walked to the speaking platform, the weight of the reconnaissance footage pressed down on him. How could he demand that the humans back down when he had seen children being murdered? Honored colleagues, he began, his voice carrying less conviction than usual. The human fleet represents a clear violation of established protocols for conflict resolution. The chamber murmured agreement. This was exactly what they wanted to hear. However, Deho continued, we must also consider the circumstances that drove them to this action. The murmurs turned confused. This wasn't the standard condemnation they expected. The situation on Kepler 442b has deteriorated beyond acceptable parameters. Civilians are being systematically murdered while we debate economic policy. Shocked silence filled the chamber. Several representatives began speaking at once, but Deho raised his voice above them. I have seen the footage that the Security Committee has classified. Children are being executed for the entertainment of Vorthak soldiers. This is not acceptable loss. This is genocide happening while we maintain our civilized procedures. The chamber erupted in chaos. The speaker called for order repeatedly, but many representatives were on their feet demanding answers. The Security Committee's classified footage was now very much a public issue. In his private box, Sujin watched her mentor commit what amounted to career suicide. But she found herself nodding in agreement. Some things were more important than diplomatic careers. The session was suspended while emergency committees formed to address this new crisis. But the damage was done. For the first time in centuries, the Galactic Council faced serious questions about whether their civilized approach was actually moral. That night, Deho sat alone in his office watching the stars through his window. In a few hours, the human fleet would arrive at Kepler 442b. The Council would probably impose sanctions on Earth and declare the humans outcasts from galactic civilization. But somewhere on that mining colony, children might live to see another day. For the first time in his career, Deho found himself hoping that civilization would lose. Admiral Kim Tae-won stood on the bridge of the Earth battleship Indomitable, watching the Kepler 442 system grow larger on the main screen. 12 human warships moved in formation behind her flagship, their hulls scarred from years of conflict in the outer colonies. These were not the sleek diplomatic vessels that impressed galactic dignitaries. These were working warships built for fighting. Admiral, we're receiving multiple transmissions from Galactic Council forces, reported Communications Officer Nam Sung-min. They're ordering us to withdraw immediately or face the consequences. Kim studied the tactical display. 3 Council patrol ships had positioned themselves between the human fleet and Kepler 442b. They were larger than her vessels and carried more advanced technology, but they were built for patrol duty, not war. Are they targeting us? She asked. Negative, Admiral. They appear to be maintaining a blocking position only. Kim nodded. The Council still believed this could be resolved through proper procedures. They would learn otherwise very soon. Open a channel to all ships, she ordered. The communications system connected her to the 11 other warship captains who had volunteered for this mission. Each of them had read the intelligence reports. Each of them had seen the footage of children being murdered while politicians debated trade policies. Captains, Kim began, her voice carrying across space to every human ship. The Galactic Council considers our presence here to be primitive aggression. They want us to withdraw and let their civilized approach continue working. She paused, looking at the planet below where 50,000 people waited to learn if anyone cared enough to save them. We are not withdrawing. We are not negotiating. We are going to get our people out, and anyone who tries to stop us will learn why humans don't abandon their own. The response from her captains was immediate and unanimous. 12 ships acknowledged orders and began moving into attack formation. The Council patrol ships detected the human fleet's change in posture and immediately began broadcasting urgent warnings. This was exactly the kind of primitive behavior they had expected from humans, but they were still shocked when it actually happened. On the planet's surface, Commander Yoon Ji-woo finished checking her assault gear one final time. She led the Marine detachment aboard the assault ship Thunder, and her troops were already preparing for immediate deployment once the orbital battle was won. Ma'am, reported Sergeant Oh Dong-hyuk, latest intelligence shows the hostages are being held in 3 separate locations. the main mining complex, the residential district, and a detention facility near the spaceport. Jiwoo studied the tactical maps that had been updated by stealth probes. The Vorthak had spread the hostages across multiple sites, probably to make rescue more difficult. They would have to hit all 3 locations simultaneously. Response time once we go loud? She asked. Vorthak garrison has approximately 2,000 soldiers, O replied. They can reinforce any position within 20 minutes. Then we finish in 15, Jiwoo said simply. Her Marines nodded. They had trained for exactly this kind of operation. Fast insertion, overwhelming violence, get the civilians out before enemy reinforcements could respond. It was the kind of mission that galactic military doctrine said was impossible without massive casualties. Galactic military doctrine had never faced human Marines. Above the planet, the confrontation was about to begin. The Council patrol ships moved to intercept the human fleet, their commanders still believing this could be resolved through proper warnings and diplomatic protests. Admiral Kim opened communications with the lead patrol ship. Council vessel, you are interfering with a humanitarian rescue operation. Withdraw immediately. Admiral Kim, came the reply from the alien commander. You are in violation of galactic law. We cannot permit military action in this system. Then stop us, Kim said, and cut the transmission. The battle that followed shocked every military observer in the galaxy. The Council ships were larger and more advanced, but they had been designed for patrol duty and ceremonial displays. They carried weapons meant to disable rather than destroy, systems built for efficiency rather than survival. The human warships attacked like wounded animals. They ignored proper formation protocols, disregarded acceptable casualty ratios, and showed no concern for their own survival. One human destroyer rammed directly into a Council cruiser, crippling both ships but clearing the way for the assault transports. They're insane, transmitted one Council captain as human fighters swarmed his vessel. They're taking casualties that would force any rational force to retreat. But the humans didn't retreat. They pressed forward through energy fire and missile strikes, losing ships but never wavering from their objective. When the flagship Indomitable took critical damage, Admiral Kim transferred her flag to a smaller ship and continued the attack. Within 6 hours, all 3 Council patrol ships were either destroyed or disabled. The human fleet had lost 4 vessels and taken severe damage to most of the rest, but they had cleared the way to the planet below. Commander Jiwoo's assault began at dawn, planet time. Thunder and 3 other assault ships broke through the atmosphere under cover of orbital bombardment. The Vorthak ground forces had never faced anything like the fury that descended on them. Human Marines dropped directly onto target buildings, using tactics that galactic military experts considered suicidal. They accepted casualties that would have caused any civilized force to abort the mission, but they kept moving forward with mechanical determination. At the main mining complex, Jiwoo led her team through Vorthak defenses like they weren't even there. The alien soldiers were trained for occupation duty, not for fighting soldiers who would rather die than fail. Hostiles in Corridor 7, reported Corporal Lee Jae-sung over the comm system. Go through them, Jiwoo replied. The Marines did exactly that. They advanced through concentrated fire, taking hits but never stopping. When their weapons ran empty, they drew knives and kept fighting. When they ran out of ammunition, they used whatever they could find as weapons. The Vorthak had never encountered anything like human desperation. Their own species fought rationally, retreating when casualties became unacceptable, surrendering when victory became impossible. These humans seemed to operate by completely different rules. In the residential district, Captain Park Min-soo found the first group of hostages. They were civilians from the original colony, including families with children. Many showed signs of malnutrition and toxic exposure from months of forced labor. Get them to the extraction point, he ordered his team. Move fast. As his Marines escorted the civilians toward the landing zones, they encountered Vorthak reinforcements moving to contain the rescue operation. The aliens expected the humans to take defensive positions and call for support. Instead, the Marines attacked. Captain Park led a direct charge into superior numbers. Knowing that every minute of delay meant more civilians in danger, his team took heavy casualties, but they broke through the Vorthak lines and cleared the route to safety. The pattern repeated across all 3 rescue sites. Human forces accepted losses that should have been impossible to sustain, yet somehow kept fighting with undiminished intensity. They seemed to care more about saving strangers than about their own survival. By the end of the first day, Commander Jiwoo's forces had secured all 3 hostage locations. The cost had been terrible. Nearly half her Marines were casualties, including Captain Park, who died holding the evacuation route open while civilians escaped. But 31,000 people were free. Everyone who could be saved had been saved. The Vorthak commander requested terms for surrender that evening. He had never faced an enemy that would accept such casualties for people who weren't even their own species. These humans were clearly insane, and he wanted no more part of fighting them. Admiral Kim accepted the surrender from her damaged flagship. Around her, the bridge showed signs of the battle, cracked displays, emergency lighting, and the smell of smoke from overloaded systems. "Admiral," reported Nam Sung-min, "we're receiving transmissions from the Galactic Council. They're demanding an immediate ceasefire and withdrawal." Kim looked at the tactical display showing the rescued civilians being transferred to hospital ships. Families were being reunited after months of separation. Children who had survived Vorthak brutality were finally safe. "Tell the Council," she said quietly, "that we'll withdraw when every civilian is evacuated and accounted for." "And if they refuse?" Kim smiled grimly. "Then they can try to make us leave." The Galactic News Network struggled to find words for what had happened at Kepler 442b. In 72 hours, the human fleet had accomplished what the Galactic Council's civilized approach had failed to achieve in 3 months. The Vorthak Empire had surrendered completely, their leadership either captured or dead, but the cost had been staggering by galactic standards. Dr. Choi Hee-jin stood in the medical bay of the hospital ship Mercy, documenting everything she witnessed. The ship's corridors were filled with rescued civilians and wounded human soldiers, creating a mixture of celebration and grief that she had never seen before. In one ward, she watched families reunite after months of separation. Parents held children they had feared they would never see again, while medical staff worked to treat the effects of toxic exposure and malnutrition. The joy in their faces was something no amount of diplomatic success could match. In another ward, human Marines lay in beds with injuries that would have killed most galactic species. These soldiers had fought through wounds that should have stopped them, driven by something the civilized galaxy had forgotten: the willingness to sacrifice everything for those who could not protect themselves. "How many?" Hee-jin asked the chief medical officer. 437 human casualties, Dr. Kang Yoo-jin replied. 112 killed in action, including Captain Lee Min-ho. The name hit Hee-jin like a physical blow. Lee had died in the final assault on the detention facility, leading his team through Vorthak defenses to reach the last group of hostages. His final transmission had been simple: "Kids are safe." "Mission complete, and the civilians?" she asked. 31,000 rescued, Dr. Kang continued. "We lost 19,000 before the rescue could reach them. Most died from toxic exposure and exhaustion during the months of forced labor." Hee-jin closed her eyes. 19,000 people had died while the Galactic Council debated proper procedure. But 31,000 lived because humans had been willing to act when action was needed. The galactic media response was swift and predictable. Every major news outlet condemned the barbaric display of primitive aggression that had violated centuries of civilized warfare protocols. Editorial writers called for severe sanctions against Earth and warned that humanity's emotional approach to conflict threatened galactic stability. But something unexpected was happening in the comment sections and public forums. For the first time, ordinary galactic citizens were seeing the true cost of their leaders' refined approach to warfare. They were asking uncomfortable questions about why it had taken primitive humans to save people their own government had written off as acceptable losses. On the core world of Centauri Prime, protesters gathered outside the regional council building carrying signs that read, "Why didn't we save them?" And who decides acceptable losses? Similar demonstrations erupted on dozens of worlds as citizens demanded to know why their advanced civilization had been less compassionate than the barbaric humans. Ambassador Kang Dae-ho watched the coverage from his office on Station Prime, his diplomatic career in ruins after his revelation about the classified footage. But as he saw the public reaction, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: hope. Park Soo-jin entered with yet another emergency summons from the security committee. "They want you to recant your statements about the massacre footage," she said quietly. "And if I refuse?" "Criminal charges for violation of state secrets. Exile from council space." Daeho looked at the images of rescued families still playing on his screen. Children who were alive because someone had cared enough to act. "Let them file their charges," he said. The security committee session was a formality. The 12 members had already decided that Daeho would serve as a scapegoat for the entire crisis. His unauthorized revelation of classified information had created a public relations disaster that needed to be contained. "Your actions have endangered galactic stability," declared the committee chair. The public was not prepared to see such disturbing imagery. "The public deserved to know what was being done in their name," Daeho replied. "Children were being murdered while we debated trade policies." "Acceptable losses in service of long-term peace," insisted another member. "Your emotional response has undermined decades of careful diplomatic progress." Daeho stared at them. Even now, faced with evidence of their failure, they clung to their procedures and protocols. They would rather sacrifice thousands of lives than admit their civilized approach had limits. "I resign," he said simply. The committee members looked shocked. Diplomatic careers were lifetime appointments. No one simply resigned from the council. "You cannot resign," the chair said. "You have a duty to galactic civilization." "Galactic civilization," Daeho replied. "Seems to have forgotten what civilization actually means." He left the chamber without waiting for dismissal, his formal robes abandoned on the floor behind him. Meanwhile, the human fleet had begun the complex process of evacuating the rescued civilians. Medical ships ferried the most seriously injured to advanced treatment facilities, while transport vessels prepared to take families to safe worlds where they could rebuild their lives. Admiral Kim Tae-won supervised the operation from her damaged flagship, now running on backup power and emergency life support. The Indomitable would need months of repairs, if it could be repaired at all. "Admiral," reported Communications Officer Nam Sung-min, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Earth Command." The message was brief but carried the weight of government policy. President Chen had recalled the fleet immediately. The Galactic Council was threatening severe economic sanctions if the humans did not withdraw from Vorthak space within 48 hours. "What are your orders, Admiral?" asked her executive officer. Kim looked at the tactical display showing civilian transports still loading refugees. "The evacuation would take at least another week to complete safely. We finished the job," she said. "Let the politicians worry about sanctions." Her crew nodded with grim satisfaction. They had not come this far and lost this much to abandon their mission now. The final confrontation came when a full council battle fleet arrived to enforce the withdrawal order. 24 advanced warships took position around the human rescue operation, their weapons trained on the damaged Earth vessels. The council commander transmitted terms for immediate surrender. The humans would be allowed to depart with their own wounded, but the civilian evacuation would be suspended pending proper diplomatic resolution of their status. Admiral Kim's response was broadcast on open channels where the galactic media could record it. "Council fleet, you are interfering with a humanitarian operation. We will not abandon these people. Admiral, you are outnumbered 20-1 and your ships are damaged. Resistance is futile." Kim looked around her bridge at officers who had already given everything for strangers they had never met. "Then fire," she said quietly. The council commander hesitated. His orders were to stop the humans, but actually firing on ships conducting a rescue operation would create an even worse public relations crisis. That hesitation was all the time Admiral Kim needed. "All ships continue evacuation operations. If they want to stop us, they'll have to shoot us." For 6 tense hours, the two fleets faced each other, while civilian transports continued loading refugees. The council ships could have destroyed the human vessels easily, but the galactic media was watching every moment. Finally, as the last transport lifted off with its cargo of rescued families, the human fleet began its withdrawal. They had completed their mission despite overwhelming opposition and the threat of galactic sanctions. As the Indomitable limped toward the hyperspace jump point, Admiral Kim received a private transmission on a secured frequency. The source code identified it as coming from Ambassador Daeho's personal communicator. "Admiral," came the alien diplomat's voice, I wanted you to know that not everyone in the galaxy has forgotten what honor means. Thank you for showing us what we had lost." The transmission ended, leaving Kim alone with her thoughts as Earth's most damaged fleet headed home to face whatever consequences awaited them. Behind them, 31,000 people lived because someone had cared enough to fight for them,